one of the seedling apple trees, one of many we have here on this property. And I'm going to turn this into a Liberty apple tree. I'm removing wood to the point where I have an approximate diameter match with my scion wood. They don't have to exactly match, but the scion wood cannot be bigger than the piece of wood, the tree you're putting it into. I'm going to split this in the middle. And carefully, you want to just rock it gently back and forth. And push down. But not hard, you don't want to run this knife into your finger. And these are dormant buds, these tiny little spots here. Make a wedge, and that's going to get pushed down into that cleft. I'm going to give this 2 buds. Obviously, you have to have at least 1. You generally don't want more than 2 because the juices that go up, you want it to be all feeding to just 1 or 2 buds. Then at the end of this, if I was bench grafting inside, I'd actually dip this in hot wax to cap it. I'm out in the field, I don't have hot wax with me, so I'm just going to use the parafilm grafting tape to wrap up the end so that it doesn't dry out. And I take the knife into the wedge, hold it open, and I'm matching cambium layers. The cambium layers are the green layer just under the bark on both sides. And I wrap this up. This parafilm, it's a waxy tape, and it keeps this from drying out. It also keeps it from getting soaked with water. And over the course of the next week or 2, hopefully, those cambium layers will fuse. And then in 2 to 3 weeks, you'll see the dormant buds start to push out and split green. And that's how you top work a tree. I'll label it. And assuming that this graft takes, once those buds push, I'll cut off the rest of this green to force all the growth into the top. In the meantime, I don't want to cut off all the green because I don't want to kill the tree. I want it to be able to keep photosynthesizing, but I did want the excess juices to be funneled up the little trunk of that tree. So this is a seedling apple tree, and this is really typical of our fields here. These fields were hayed and mowed for probably 30 years before we bought the property. And bears and whatever come through and they'd eat the apples, and they take a crap. The apple seeds pass through fast enough, they'll grow a tree. And you come through and you keep mowing that little seedling tree down. You end up with a huge series of roots underground, but a lot of different tops. And if you look close enough, you can see that these have been damaged. These are damaged by our meadow voles, which are kind of the bane of our existence here. And this middle one, though, although it's been chewed on, it's completely healed over the spots that it's chewed. So what we're going to do is I'm going to save this main tree out of the 3 that are here. They're all the same rootstock. We're going to force all this growth into just one. See, there's another one coming up. Now, the variety I have here is called Robin. It's from his friend who lives in Seattle. And here's about the match mark. So I'm going to cut this here. I'm going to cut this right here. I'm going to make my wedge cut here. The spot that it's going to go in, match it up, is right here. Okay. this. Put it here. I got 2 buds. 1, 2. I'm going to wrap the end in parafilm. So it doesn't dry out. I'm going to open this top up. You can see the green cambium layer there. The bark's really slipping. Oops. I got the cambium layers matched here and here. As the tree grows, and if this takes, they grow really fast. I'll show you one later that we did on one not much taller than this 3 years ago. I'm going to leave just this branch to keep it photosynthesizing. I'm going to cut the rest of these off. When you prune these, this is called the collar, this point right here. If you cut right there, the tree heals it over really quickly. Good general rule of thumb to follow when you're doing any pruning. You also want to come through and brush off any green that grows later in the year, like these. You can just brush those off. Once again, this gives you a standard tree. A rootstock grown from seed that's withstood whatever trials and tribulations to live this long. And if left alone, basically these things live hundreds of years. As long as you don't mess them up. Mother Nature knows how to grow trees. We keep thinking that we do. Although we can control variables and give ourselves predictable outcomes, the predictable outcomes aren't the best outcomes for the trees. Tend to be shorter lifespans and diseases and all that other crap. For the most part, these wild trees don't have to deal with. So they weren't strong enough to make it in the first place. They'd be dead already. Here's a case where this tree has been mowed down, well, probably a dozen times. The rootstock it's growing off of is huge. I'm going to try to reduce this down to 1. It does not have a lot of evidence, damage evidence from metal voles. Once again, when this thing gets going, all the energy going into one growth, it's going to grow fast. It's also likely to send up more suckers, and we'll have to be kind of diligent through the summer coming back and cutting those out to force all of the growth just into one. One of the big problems with nursery trees you run into, they're almost all on what's called clonal rootstock, which for all practical purposes, if you want to think of this, it is cloning itself again and again. What they'll do in the nurseries is they'll pile a bunch of wet sawdust around the base of the tree, basically cut the whole thing down, and they'll put up a whole bunch of these and they'll all root in. It's called stooling a tree, and you're making exact copies of that tree. They're not doing it for the apples that come off of the top. They're doing it for the growth and fruit setting patterns of the rootstock. Generally, they're smaller trees. They start producing early, but they don't live very long. The reason they're smaller trees is because, quite literally, there's something wrong with them. The roots tend to be fairly shallow in general. They cannot feed the tree well enough to live long, and because the tree's not going to live very long, like most things, plants, if you stress them out, they try to reproduce themselves more quickly because they're going to die young. So with the coronal rootstocks, a lot of those trees, you're going to start getting fairly decent fruit production in only a couple of years. And it's not a bad thing in a general way. But anytime something is specifically bred or developed or propagated, that is not healthy, and you're growing it specifically because it's not healthy. You're growing it because you have that predictable rate of production. You know, within X number of years, with X chemical inputs, you're going to have a specific crop. You know, and if you're a banker giving a loan to somebody, knowing exactly what that's going to be is an important thing. That loan's going to be paid off in 30 years, and you know exactly what the income behind that loan is going to be. That's good. Problem with that is, in 30 years, most of those trees are done, literally done. They're not going to live much longer than that. Of course, the loan's paid off. The banker's happy. But your orchard's dead. You stop replanting. There's a lot of how this society works this stuff. Everything's become disposable, temporary. Nobody's thinking about the long term. It's the short term. And I'm not building this orchard for me. I'm trying to build a forever place. It's going to outlive me, hopefully, outlive my kids, outlive my grandkids, have a place that just a little bit of effort produces more food than a family can reasonably eat, which this place already does, and keep producing. Just letting it be what it, for the most part, naturally wants to be. And instead of tilling all this stuff under, killing everything that's here, working with the place instead. I'll have to admit, if I had just done all of that pruning out of all of those other roots and left it at this, it would have given me a standard apple tree of whatever this was going to be. I can tell by all these tiny little nodules it was probably going to be a crab apple of some kind, and a lot of these wild trees are that, crabs. At the same time, this property, we have found multiple wild trees that give us fantastic eating apples. And that's been kind of fun. That was just a Macintosh. But next I'm going to do one that's reproducing one of the trees we already have in this property. And we call it Westridge. I'm going to top this one with Westridge. I'm going to show you the original tree eventually here. But this tree has never been mowed down. But it has taken some severe damage in years past from meadow voles. And last year we got the whole property mowed. But it's almost healed itself completely around where the animals had eaten into it. And has shown fairly vigorous top growth, so I don't mind grafting this one. Appears it's going to be a successfully productive tree. Quite often when these trees are girdled by animals, the top is so compromised that it'll put up a whole bunch of suckers as the tree figures out that that top's going to die. This one didn't, and like I said, it healed itself all the way around. When we first started planting here, we had no idea how bad meadow voles were in regards to trees, or even that we really had them. We knew that there was deer here. Those have mostly disappeared due to the wolves. But meadow voles, on the other hand, once this place hadn't been plowed in a long time. When you plow up a field and keep it mowed, the meadow voles go away. First of all, when you plow up a field, you're killing pretty much everything that's there that's bigger than an inch or two long. Whether it's the worms or the snakes or the meadow voles or the mice, it all gets chopped up and into the soil. And in regular farming, that's happening every single year. When you're not plowing stuff up, everything that lives in that soil keeps living. And in the case of meadow voles, which is just, a lot of people think they're mice when they see them. They're not. They have shorter tails. They live on or near the surface, which makes them really susceptible to getting plowed by a plow. They're more closely related to muskrats, maybe, including their tail, maybe 5 inches long. Besides eating all the green stuff that's out here, in the wintertime, they still live mostly on the surface. And they find these trees, they'll just eat that bark all the way out, all the way around, and all the way through to get to that cambium layer. And then you're stuck with a bunch of dead trees putting up new suckers, which for a seedling apple tree, it just waits until, for whatever reason, there's some years where there's no meadow voles. They can get thick enough bark that they leave it alone. If you're grafting trees, you're left with a rootstock, but not whatever the hell you put on the top. So, combination of all kinds of reasons. Our first plantings of trees, we lost most of them. It's just all learning experience. A seedling Antonovka tree. Antonovkas are one of the few apple trees that can be grown fairly true to type from seed. And they were developed hundreds of years ago for propagating trees across northern reaches of Russia and Siberia that were really the borderline for being able to do more than wild food gathering. If you're grafting onto seedling apples and they're not seeds you've collected and sprouted yourself, quite often they're Antonovkas. I have friends that have grown Antonovkas. They say it's a pretty decent tasting apple. The first year we planted 100 of them. About a dozen made it through the meadow vole. That's one of them. And you can see that window screen we put around the bottom. That's basically how we saved our initial trees. Is we put a barrier that the meadow voles didn't go through. This is the original Westridge apple tree, and it was, when we found it, probably about a 12-foot tall tree, growing just in the edge of the woods here. And the third year we had the property, it had some apples on it, and we picked them, and they were absolutely fantastic. And all apples taste like apples, but every apple tastes different. And this one was not only great tasting, it was different than anything we tasted. Took a couple of them to an orchardist friend of mine, and who knows, hundreds of varieties, and I gave him the apple, and he bit into this and he said, "What is this?" And I said, "It's ours. It's from a wild tree on our property." He said, "You can propagate this, you'll be a millionaire." I'll have to admit, the way they've printed money since then, becoming a millionaire isn't as impressive as it used to be. But we've made dozens of these trees and planted them through grafting, both on bench grafting at home from rootstocks we ordered, and on trees that were just growing on the property here. I'm going to show you one that's 3 years old. It was one of the first field graftings basically we did on a seedling tree that was growing on this orchard before we ever bought it. Another one of those has been mowed down a couple of times. It had a significant amount of damage on this side. Although it must have sent up suckers early, once it's healed itself over, it became the primary stock on here. So I'm going to use it. I put a Sweet 16 on this. Sweet 16's one of those apples that I honestly hadn't eaten until I started meeting orchardists. And of the commercial varieties, beats the hell out of them, almost all of them. The most common variety that people talk about is Honeycrisp. There's nothing wrong with Honeycrisp. Honeycrisp is a really decent apple. But universally, the orchardists that I talk to hate it. It's a really touchy tree, they say. It has really fragile wood. You've got to literally get rid of most of the apples on it, or breaks the branches off. And when the branches break off, it leaves it susceptible to disease, and they gotta use tons of chemicals on the things. And the other thing they usually say is the reason Honeycrisp was so popular is because of the marketing done. If it wasn't for the marketing, the apple that it really replaced was Fireside. Another fantastic apple, and that is, I do like Firesides better than Honeycrisps. It's also marketed under the name Connell Red. It's from the 1930s breeding programs at the University of Minnesota. And the big thing with Honeycrisp is it lasts about 4 more weeks in refrigerated storage than Fireside. Try finding a Fireside tree now. Most of the orchards that were growing them cut them down to replace them with Honeycrisp because of the University of Minnesota's marketing program. As far as eating quality goes, I'll take a Fireside or Connell Red over a Honeycrisp any day. Just a better tasting apple. This is an interesting thing here. We had a lot of snow here this winter. Nell and I came out, and in the back part of the woods, there's over 7 feet. And all these branches were torn off. This is just from the weight of the snow settling. And it's exposed a lot of the inner wood. It's dried out. At some point in the past, on the bottom, it was nearly completely girdled. And it's healed itself back over, and it's grown quite a bit since then. However, most of the new growth last year is right here. This is how much this tree grew last year on this side. I'm going to graft into this piece. I'm going to cut this piece out. And then hopefully, once this grows up, I won't have to worry about the weight of snow peeling branches off, because what I'm going to graft is going to start up this high. And eventually most of it will be above the snow. One of the biggest problems that you run into with clonal rootstocks, like I said before, the predictability of their outcomes in production, lifespan, and all that is seen by a lot of the standardizing community as a good thing. But if you have an entire orchard intensively planted with clonal rootstocks, no matter how many types of tops of apple trees that you have out there, you've only got one type of tree growing underground. And what's underground is 1.5 to 2 times as much as you have above ground on a tree that's not being pruned. In these orchards, all of the roots end up fusing together, much the same way that we're fusing the tops of these trees to a new variety. If you only have literally one tree in your orchard this way, because like I said, when that orchard grows up, all those roots are mixed together. There's not enough space between the trees. This is all, go to almost any orchard nowadays. Quite often the trees, even if they're 20 feet tall, aren't planted more than 4 or 5 feet apart. This necessitates wildly excessive chemical use. Specifically because you get any disease in there that one tree, type of tree is susceptible to, you can lose your whole orchard really quickly. One would think this would be seen as a bad thing. But on the sustainability side of it, it is a bad thing. Because unless you've got a way to create a whole bunch of chemicals on your own, you don't have any way to take care of that orchard without external inputs. When I say external, I don't mean things you put on, things you can't get from somewhere else. You lose some stupid part of a system due to a production shutdown somewhere, and it's something you need, it's all gone. We watched things as simple as eggs disappear from our grocery stores a couple of years ago. Obviously they came back. And it isn't something that affected us in a directly negative way, although it did reinforce the need to not depend on external inputs that you cannot control. So if you see an orchard holding itself out as organic, and it's intensively planted with dwarf trees, my general take on it is that it's organic until they suddenly realize they can't be, because those trees have grown up and you get a disease in there. Now, you can plant clonal dwarf trees and generally not have to worry about at least soil-based diseases and viruses by simply planting them far enough apart. But since most of the point of the dwarf trees is highly intensive, predictable production in a very short time frame, the last thing you're going to do is waste open ground. Almost all of that industry has been designed to use soil that's basically reduced to damn near sterility as far as the organically available nutrients, and entirely dependent upon chemical inputs, which sells chemicals. Once again, if you want an exact outcome, exact number of bushels in a specific time frame, yeah, that's one way to do it. We call this tree Sweet Summer Cider, and it has two basic trunks come all the way down, come from the ground. And we know this is an old seedling tree because both trunks give us the exact same kind of apple. And we pruned it to be open. Kids can climb in it, easy to pick, kind of fun. Had to put a cage around the whole thing because after we pruned it the first time, we found that making it easy for kids to climb, meaning it was easy for bears to climb, and they climbed way out on the branches and broke them off. Haven't had that problem for a couple years. But directly over here then, we had a cluster of seedling trees that were about 4.5 feet tall, and there was multiples of them. And as I said, the West Ridge. The first field graft I did was on this West Ridge right here. And that was 3 springs ago. And I cut out all the other ones growing out and put that small piece of West Ridge in there. And the ensuing couple of years, this is how big it's gotten. And the wood that I took off of it when I was grafting West Ridges, this is where I got the wood for, doing that graft. This is a graft we did last year. It's kind of in the chicken yard. If you come in close here, you can see. This is on its second year now. There's that wedge in. We've kept the bottom part of it clean, and this will be the new top. There's where I had capped it so it wouldn't dry out. This isn't a West Ridge. We call this Clefman, which comes from a whole bunch of seedling apples that we started over 100 of them back when my daughter Nell was 4 years old, just as a project. They were fireside apple seeds in an orchard that was fireside and Honeycrisp. So we figured it was pollinated with Honeycrisp. We have this original tree in our yard back home. They're a great eating apple. But in a couple years, this should be giving us apples as well.